Did his doctoral work on artificial intelligence and theological anthropology. And he is now working on a follow-up project at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam as a postdoctoral researcher. And he will be talking to us on a theme which is, I think, close to the heart of his own research, entitled Rethinking Imago Dei Between Darwin and Artificial Intelligence, a case study of progress in theology. We're curious to hear what you have to say about that. Dr. Dorobantu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I realize it's Friday, 5 p.m., so although your bodies might still be here, and perhaps your brains as well, your minds might understandably be trying to escape. So to keep you engaged, I will make use of some very outrageous claims, scandalous simplifications, cliffhangers, and the promise of a very controversial conclusion. So in that spirit, let me begin by shamelessly placing my name next to this great Oxford theologian from the 19th century, because I think one of my theses today is a paraphrase of his words, namely that artificial intelligence can be seen as a friend and not a foe for theology. But what I really want to argue is that epistemic progress in theology is possible, and it is visibly illustrated in the way we have reimagined Imago Dei theology in the past century or so. Just as a disclaimer, I was expecting this conference to be much more debating the problem of progress. I was not expecting so much agreement that there can be progress in theology. So I was planning to score the winning goal now in the extra time by really convincing you that progress is possible, but now we all agree it is possible. So my mission in a way is made easier with that. So the question of the psalmist is as relevant today as ever, and there's an entire field, that of theological anthropology, that has been wrestling with it. But the notion that we humans are created in the image of likeness of God is arguably, from a theological point of view, the most relevant one we can say about human beings. We don't know exactly what it means to be in the image of God, but we mostly know two things. Firstly, that the image makes us like God, is something that makes us like God. Secondly, that it distinguishes us from other creatures. And to that, we might add a third one, that we can agree that the perfect instantiation of the image is the person of Jesus Christ. Because there are not many clues in the Bible about what the image means, theologians throughout centuries have done their best to interpret it, guided mainly by common sense and by the zeitgeist. And there was, of course, a great temptation to interpret it as some sort of intellectual capacity, usually reason or intelligence, unsurprisingly, given the Aristotelian tradition of seeing the human as the rational animal. This came to be known as the substantial interpretation of the image of God, and was the most popular up until very recently, relatively recently, in historical times. But then came Darwin and then further refinements of his evolutionary theory, and these questioned the idea that we are as different from the animals as we used to think. We stem from the same tree of life as the non-human animals, and more importantly, our cognitive capacities are not magical or disembodied, but very much rooted in our biology. So what's more, they are found in, if you want, rudimentary form in many of the animals. So after Darwin, it was still possible to think of intelligence as the mark of Imago Dei, given that we seem to have intelligence in a much more degree than most of the animals have it. But for theologians, this was also an opportunity to start to question the basic assumption that Imago Dei is a cognitive capacity in the first place. As a result, they came up with various proposals, namely functional, relational, and eschatological. These are the most important. And so, lo and behold, progress in theology already. To me, I'm convinced by each of them. So whenever I read one of these proposals, I'm tempted to think, oh, this is it. But then I read another one, and that convinces me as well. And this points to the problem that there are very with theological reasons alone, I think there are good arguments for each of these proposals. On the other hand, there are people like Oliver Crisp and Aku Visala who point out that most of these non-substantive interpretations are still relying on substantive, on some capacities, because to be in a relationship, you need to have some sort of capacities, or to have this existential drive towards God that has to be rooted somehow in some capacity of our minds. So there is a lot of debate here. But how can we think of all this progress in theology from before Darwin and after Darwin? And I think a useful scheme here is that proposed by Dutch theologian Benno van den Toren, who differentiates between doctrine and theological theory. And I think this distinction has been made many times in history with different names. I found this in a contribution he made to a wonderful collective volume, Finding Ourselves After Darwin, in which Gijsbert van den Brink also has a chapter. In van den Toren's view, doctrine represents the non-negotiable core of our belief, whereas theological theory is the way we are articulating that intuition in our discourse and in conversation with contemporary thought, usually. So if you want to think about doctrine as the molten core of belief, theological theory is the outer shell that is always exposed to the exterior forces. If we look at the evolution of Imago Dei interpretations, I think we can distinguish between the core doctrine, which is the intuition that we are distinctive and like God, which is shared across centuries and arguably also across cultures, a little bit less in the East Asian cultures. They don't think about human distinctiveness in the same terms as we do. But we do find this almost universal intuition that we are distinctive. And then theological theory is constituted by how we interpret that, and you can have substantive, functional. So I see a progress here in the theological theory without altering the doctrine itself. Perhaps the doctrine stays the same, the intuition is there, but how we explain that changes. So perhaps this is a place where progress can occur in theology. Going back to the three interpretations outlined before, as I said, on theological grounds alone, it is difficult to decide between them. So we have a new problem, a better kind of problem, but still a problem. How do we choose the winner? Around 100 years after Darwin, theological anthropology was faced with a new challenge or opportunity, whichever way you think about it, namely the field of artificial intelligence. So from the second half of the previous century, machines started to become better at tasks that we used to think require human intelligence, like playing chess, as you can see here, the famous chess match between Garry Kasparov and IBM's Deep Blue, or proving mathematical theorems, and more recently composing musical symphonies. So they do all these things. I'm not going to go into the details of how each AI architecture does that. So you have symbolic AI, you have machine learning, and they all do these things very differently from each other and from how the human mind does them. And that is a very relevant topic of discussion. But let's bracket that for the time being and just notice that they seem to work remarkably well. So they do the things that we do, and they may work, these technologies may work even better in the future. So for Imago Dei theology, I think firstly this means that there is a final blow being delivered to the substantial interpretation of the image of God. It cannot be that intelligence understood as reason, rationality, or problem solving is the mark of the divine, because if we accept that, then we should also accept that machines are already in some respect more in the image of God than we are. Where the animals lacked in degree, I think AI is exceeding now. So I think that is interesting for theological anthropology. And secondly, the emergence of AI brings some interesting challenges to the other interpretations mentioned before, and potentially an additional hurdle that can help us choose the winner between those. So an additional restriction in our definition. In particular, the idea of human-level artificial intelligence, if it's debatable whether that is possible or not, but in principle, people say we cannot exclude that. That raises some good questions about what it means to be human and in the image of God. And the short dialogue from the TV series Westworld can be illustrative, because here you have this human character realizing that he might be talking to a robot and not to a real woman. And he asks her, "Are you real?" And her answer is very thought-provoking, because she says, "If you can't tell, does it matter?" And I think that had such perfect androids, if we had such perfect androids walking around us one day, could we still speak of the Imago Dei? And if so, how? And there are two options, in my view. The first one is to shift towards yet another type of interpretation, sometimes called a performative interpretation. This is proposed by theologians Anne First and Karen O'Donnell, who both proposed this in dialogue with the field of artificial intelligence. In their view, Imago Dei is more of an attitude than an attribute. So it's an attitude of a conscious orientation towards finding the image of God in the others and towards God. It resembles a little bit the existential eschatological interpretation. This interpretation is not too keen on preserving human distinctiveness, and it is open to the possibility that robots might as well be in the image of God one day if they display the same kind of attitude. If you think that's a bit too much, perhaps because it seems to alter our intuition of distinctiveness, so it chips a little bit to the core of the doctrine and it doesn't stay within the theological theory realm, then perhaps you will like the second option better. So in my own view, humans are still distinctive, but AI can serve as a key delimitation of what Imago Dei is not. For example, we might look at the things that AI is notoriously struggling with and perhaps see their clues about what makes us in the image of God. There is no time to dive into details right now, but in my dissertation and in the series of papers, I make a very convoluted argument that the successes and failures of AI so far point to relationality, vulnerability, and embodiment as key notions for the emergence of a human-like type of creature, one that can be a vessel for divine incarnation. So I'm not going to explain why now, but I do support, I think thinking about AI does lend support to a relational interpretation of Imago Dei. So the main theological lesson we can learn here from AI is that for a creature to be in the Imago Dei, the limitations are perhaps just as relevant as the capabilities. The reason why we are such a profoundly relational creature have less to do with our intellectual might, and they have more to do with our vulnerability, our irrationality. Love is irrational after all, and love is such an important aspect of being in the image of God. And also with our lack of self-sufficiency. A creature that is sufficient in itself is never looking for relationship because it has no incentive to do so. So looking at Imago Dei from the prism of the incarnation and evolutionary theory, we can ask the following question. What kind of creature was needed to evolve for God to be able to incarnate and have personal relationships with? And if we look at it this way, then some degree of intelligence is, of course, relevant, because God did not incarnate as any creature. God did not incarnate as a crocodile, or as far as we know it. So God did wait for a certain kind of creature to emerge, which is us. But then if we triangulate this information with what we get from AI, then we also can speak of an upper limit of intelligence, perhaps, for, or rationality. And we see these machines that are hyper-rational. They are much more rational than we could ever be. And precisely because of that, they fall outside of the scope of beings that can be in a personal relationship with God. So you can imagine a very rational being that is an ethical monster that lacks any kind of empathy. These two are not correlated. And with this, I arrive at the controversial conclusion that I promised at the beginning, that intelligence might be, after all, a factor in the Imago Dei, but just in a slightly different way than we used to think about it. So I'm thinking of a Goldilocks of intelligence. I borrowed this from planetary science. Goldilocks is a region where a planet can be where it's not too hot and not too cold for liquid water to exist. And if you allow me for a moment to reduce such a complex notion as intelligence to a linear dimension, I think we can think of a Goldilocks type of sweet spot of intelligence, one that is not too much and not too little for a creature to be able to engage in personal relationships and thus be capable of being in the image of God. In this picture here, you can think that to the left, we have artificial intelligence, that is too hot, is too much. To the right, we have animals, which is too cold, too little. And maybe this is also an analogy for the left and right hemispheres of the brain. So too left is too much rationality, too little to the right is perhaps not enough of it. So the real scandalous idea is that had we been more rational, as some transhumanists hope to become by augmenting themselves, we might have fallen outside of the scope of Imago Dei. So in terms of what renders us in the image of God, less is sometimes more. And whether you agree or disagree with this, you must admit that we've come a long way since from the psalmist's question, and that must qualify as at least some sort of progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There is a first question by, let's see, Luca Settimo from the Zoom.